Welcome back, everyone. We'll now be looking at the largest of these subsections, at least in terms of the slide content that I'll be presenting, biases and stereotypes. So along the way here, I'll try to wrap up everything that we haven't already covered about stereotypes that's relevant to an allied health perspective, and also throw in explanations for a longer list of biases that we didn't touch on when we were talking about biases and heuristics before. Just, again, to round out what you need to know but you haven't been told yet. So, we were talking just before about the fundamental attribution error at the end of the previous video, this tendency for us to over-ascribe, relative to ourselves, to over-ascribe to other people the idea that anything that they do, especially any bad thing that they do, is due to, their own personal character or their own personal failings. It's an internal or dispositional attribution that we tend to make under those circumstances. When I say there's a double standard to that, part of that comes down to this idea that we're more likely to believe bad things about other people and more likely to believe good things about ourselves because we have a set of biases that in the literature, they cover a lot of different domains, and I'm introducing them here because they intersect with attributional biases that are referred to as the self-serving biases. It's a way in which we tend to color our perception of the world in favor of ourselves in order to feel good about ourselves. It ties in with the Freudian psychodynamic concept of a defense mechanism. All of your defense mechanisms have some grounding in a self-serving bias, in a desire to see yourself in a positive way, and therefore not feel psychologically threatened by things that go wrong for you. So, as the name implies, having self-serving biases is trying to account for the degree to which we view the world in ways, and we recall things in ways, and we behave in ways that suggest that we see ourselves in an overly positive light. We try to see ourselves in overly positive lights in order to support our sense of self-esteem, which is something we'll talk about a bit later. But, so broadly speaking, this is a good way to summarize it that I have down in the slides here. Broadly speaking, standard human cognition contains biases such that we each tend to believe, unless we're depressed, that is, but we each tend to believe, typically speaking, that we are all a little taller, thinner, smarter, better looking, more likable, and more in control of our lives than we really are. All of those domains tend to hold a little bit true for people. Although, again, I should mention that when people experience the emotional state or the ongoing clinical condition of depression, the noteworthy characteristic of that is that your self-serving biases get toned down and stripped away to a certain extent. So the general notion is, when we're trying to attribute the world around us, what things are due to my skills and character, what things are due to luck and fortune, or good or bad luck, you tend to nudge yourself a little bit in a direction here to think that you deserve, it's due to your skills and abilities, that you deserve the good things that happen to you, but when bad things happen to you, it's bad luck. That's the bias that we're sort of dealing with here. So, again, these biases are so universal that it is so difficult for us to really notice what somebody speaking about themselves without using self-serving biases looks like, unless we look at people who have depression and therefore have these biases turned down. This is referred to as a phenomenon called depressive realism, at least in regular amounts of time that people experience depression for, not for very long forms of clinical depression and things like this, of major depressive disorder. When people are at least in brief periods of depression, the way they tend to describe their lives is more accurate than it is under regular circumstances, because we see less of their self-serving biases. People sometimes say things like, yeah, I'm not really special. When you think about it, I'm just like anybody else in most ways. One day I will die, and then the world will not remember me. Everyone who does remember me will soon forget, or they will die, and then my memory will be lost with them. I won't achieve anything great in my life that will live on for years after the fact, and then maybe the human race will go extinct. All of those things, almost certainly true for any given person. They're truthful things to say, but they sound sad, they sound alarming and imposing to us, specifically because we're so used to hearing people referring to themselves with a bit of a positive bias. I'm an overweight man, but it would be odd. Like, a lot of people are taken aback if I were to say to them, like, oh yeah, I'm fat. What's my life? I'm fat, or something like this. We're so used to people describing themselves as like, well, I'm a bit on the portly side, I'm a bit of a husky gentleman, something like this. Our self-serving biases are such that we're always trying to take the edge off bad things about ourselves and talk up things that are good about ourselves. So, again, when you're looking at the fundamental attribution error, the fundamental attribution error tends to play out as part of a larger phenomenon. The overall bias that the fundamental attribution error is one half of is referred to as the actor-observer bias. So if you take fundamental attribution error add it together with your self-serving biases, you get this overall actor-observer bias, where we tend to generally say that my behavior, is usually good and I'm in control of it. It happens because of me and I own everything about it. But when something bad happens, then I don't own it and it's because of bad luck and things like this. But the exact opposite is true for everybody else. We apply these ego defenses to ourselves to feel better about ourselves and change the patterns of our attribution because of it. But for other people, especially other people we don't know very well or are hostile to, we tend to say, well, whatever they do is descriptive of their personality, and if something bad's happening for them, they deserve it. It isn't just bad luck. That's the general inconsistent double standard pattern we apply with what we refer to as the actor-observer bias. So, just to give a quick example of the actor-observer bias in effect here, if somebody were to fail an exam, let's say I failed an exam, although I never have, because, that's not uncommon for people who have PhDs, we tend to be huge nerds, but, so if I'd ever failed an exam, I might have said to myself, well, I didn't really study for this, plus the questions were just unfairly phrased anyway, and it doesn't really reflect my ability, I'll do much better next time. So you can see in that my self-serving biases mixing with attribution errors, fundamental attribution error, to create a kind of actor-observer double standard. The double standard would be clear if I had passed that test and then somebody was complaining to me, or I heard about somebody else who had failed a test that I had passed. Under those circumstances, I'd be more likely to say something like, huh, what a shame. I guess they're just not that bright. Maybe they're not cut out for this course. What's that you say? You couldn't study enough. Don't make excuses for your failures, etc. This is the double standard at play. I hope I'm being illustrative enough with this. That's generally what we're talking about when we talk about you get the combination of your attribution biases, so the fundamental attribution error in particular, with your self-serving biases to get larger effects like the actor-observer bias. So, I have a few graphics about this. Yay, I got an A+, I'm so smart, it's because of me. Whereas, an F grade, she mustn't like me, there's bias against me somehow for this to have turned out this way. Or, there's a couple of other ways that self-serving biases and the actor-observer bias come out in these ways. Sometimes you intentionally compare yourself only to people who you know you'll do better than, or you'll play up your own successes while downplaying those of others to create an uneven playing field of comparison. Generally speaking, when we have self-serving bias applied to our attributions and it comes out as the actor-observer bias, if for the self, success is internal and failure is external. For other people, success is external, oh, they got lucky, and failure is internal. They deserve what they get. Now, some of you are likely thinking at this point, and it's the segue into the second part of this, you might be thinking, well, I don't just apply those biases. I've actually got a typo here, to O's biases, to myself versus others. I also extend some of those positive biases to my friends and loved ones. And that is exactly right. In fact, the way self-serving biases interact with our social categorizations is a big reason why we have this, not just a self versus other dichotomy, but what we refer to as the in-group, out-group phenomenon. The double standards we mentally apply to people we view as belonging to a group that we are in, versus that's an in-group, versus people who belong to any outsider group or rival group that doesn't include us in any way, what we call out-groups. So this is a kind of mental categorization that we do on the basis of group membership as human beings, because we form all of these alliances and friendships and organizations and things like this. We are mentally primed to kind of track other people's multiple forms of group membership. We're very mentally good at that. In essence, we base some of our self-esteem not only on do I think I'm a good person by broad standards, but you ask yourself, what groups am I a member of, and am I a good member of that group? Do I live up to the social expectations of that group? Am I a good student? Am I a good Australian? Am I a good cricket player, whatever it happens to be for you? These are the kind of things that inform what we'll talk about later on as your self-concept and part of your self-esteem. It's not all benign in that sense. I mean, the reason why we put so much effort into tracking group membership, who's our in-group, who's our out-group, etc., is because our minds are built in such a way as to presume that we might at any given time come into conflict with members of our outgroups. So that's why we don't extend them as much empathy. We don't extend members of our outgroups the same degree of bias as we do, like positive bias, as we do our in-group members. We tend to homogenize, think that they're all the same, and stigmatize members of outgroups. So, I mean, if I were to give you the theory that most succinctly describes how all this comes together, it was a theory formed in the 1970s by Henry Tajfel, was an old social psychologist on this. He referred to this as social identity theory. And when we're talking about how we socially categorize groups, the social cognition of how we perceive groups and how we think about them, he broke it down to just 3 simple phases. 1, social categorization. We ask ourselves, what groups exist in the world? Based on how people identify, how they decorate themselves, what allegiances they show, what groups exist in the world around me. 2, social identification. Which of those groups are my groups? Which groups do I belong to? What are my in-groups? What groups do I not belong to? They're my out-groups. Excuse me. And the last stage is social comparison. You can't just let it lie like that. You have to compare your in-groups to your out-groups. Are my groups better than the others? We will make evaluations like that. Sometimes we will say, no, other groups are better than us, but we are very biased in favor of saying yes because of our self-serving biases. We want to think the best of ourselves and our in-group members. This is where you get that essential us versus them dichotomy. The idea that people who are like me in my group so I can identify with have an intrinsic nobility to them, whereas outsiders or strangers or people from far away are inherently suspicious and inherently homogenized and unlikable. So you sometimes see this even reflected on the level of the language that people use. There's all kinds of different words that we have that describe the exact same groups of people, but the cultural lexicon will have an ideological component to it. There's multiple versions of the words that describe a group, depending on whether they are your in-group or out-group. I mean, what is the difference between an atheist and a heretic? Well, it depends on whether that is your in-group or that is your out-group, to the most part. I mean, only people from a religiously conservative out-group would call an atheist a heretic. What's the difference between a freedom fighter and a terrorist? It's a heavy thing to sort of say, but everyone is a terrorist when they commit violent acts against civilian populations, unless you are in their in-group and you think they're doing it for a very good reason. Then they're freedom fighters. What's the difference between a men's rights activist and a misogynist loser? Again, that really hinges on whether they are your in-group or your out-group. It's very easy to be kind of sneering and denigrating towards them when you're on the outside of their concerns. So, with these group biases, again, just think of it as the categorical way we see the social world, showing, giving life to our basic form of self-serving biases. We see ourselves in our in-group members, and thus we see our in-group members as being more noble, individual, nuanced, and self-determined than we would otherwise be tempted to see them as. That's the bias in their favor that we see them with. Whereas we see our out-group members in a more negative light. We see them as more homogeneous, containing less variation. They're more dictated by stable internal factors. They have a nature or a character that they all share together that determines most of what they do, whereas we are all very variable and interesting and different. Again, you will always see exceptions to this, but on a social cognitive level, this is what the bias is. This is why you so often see people, saying, oh, they're all alike, and things like this. It's part of how we think of outgroups on a structural level. It's the me versus you sort of thing, us versus them. So this ties in with some of the material we've already talked about with relation to stereotypes. When we were talking about ability tests, we talked a lot about stereotype threat back then, and how being aware of stereotypes about a group that you belong to can cause you different forms of anxiety and impair your performance. Just to hammer in the final details of that, so that I'm not leaving it hanging. Stereotypes, when we talk about them broadly speaking from a psychological perspective, are sweeping generalizations of social groups which shape our expectations and subsequent social judgments about them, be they groups determined by gender, racial background, nationality, religious groups, etc. Generally speaking, the term we use in social psychology for these kinds of knowledge structures, I touched on this a little bit in memory, is schemas. They just structure our expectations. They're internal working models for how we think about things in the world. And a schema as applied to a group of real people is a stereotype. And part of the biases that we show, and part of the pernicious thought that we have, especially towards outgroup members, is born of the way that these stereotypes function for us on a social cognitive level. The 3 main things to keep in mind are: we process information more quickly when it's consistent with our stereotypes. So that's an important thing to keep in mind here, that seeing our stereotypes be defied is difficult to wrap your head around, and yet we're very quick to wrap our heads around seeing what we were already expecting. We focus attention more easily on information that is consistent with our stereotypes. Again, that's part of what gives them their momentum, and most perniciously, most insidiously, we use tacit inferences to make inconsistent details fit together when we think we are seeing our stereotypes be defied. You know, when we see something like, you know, a particular group of people who we associate with being dangerous or criminal or something like this, being perfectly benign, we often make guesswork. We make tacit inferences about things that we could not possibly know, like their secret intent or what they'd just been doing in the past or something like this, in order to make it fit. You know, oh, those people didn't harass me, but maybe they were thinking about it, and maybe I was in danger but didn't realize, etc. That's the kind of thing that stereotype thinking gets you. You know, you try to maintain the stereotype by seeing the world in a way that is consistent with that stereotype. So that's one of the reasons why stereotypes are vulnerable to illusory correlations. That is to say that you associate something with a particular real-world group, you ascribe to them a property that doesn't actually really apply to them. I mean, a lot of stereotypes are true, and it can be bad to apply stereotypes to people even when on a group level they're accurate, because, you know, it's not necessarily true for any one individual. But there's all kinds of correlations that even on a statistical level don't actually appear in a lot of real-world populations. Most of the correlations between ethnic minority groups and certain criminal instances are illusory correlations. The idea that women are always irrational or emotional or something like this is an illusory correlation. Maybe my favorite example of this is the idea that British people have really bad teeth. That was true once upon a time, but people still have that stereotype today, even though now it's an illusory correlation. People from the UK, you know, are in the top several in the world for nations of people who have very strong dental health care and are in a good position that way. So illusory correlations especially account for why stereotypes feed into prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice being negative attitudes towards people based on their group memberships, discrimination being unfair treatment or behavior towards people based on those prejudiced attitudes. So the last little bias that I have to mention here, because it's the string that holds all of these together at the end, is confirmation bias. You might just think, well, we have some bad stereotypes out there. They feed into people's prejudices, but, you know, surely we can just fix this. Surely we can inform people of the truth and they'll get out of this. Not necessarily the case. The reason that a lot of these prejudices and stereotypes are so sticky and so difficult to engage with, they come up a lot in real-world health settings or public outreach settings and things like this, is specifically because, again, like I was saying, we process information consistent with our stereotypes better, we make tacit inferences about them. All of this is connected to the more fundamental effect here that I've touched on briefly earlier in these lectures, the confirmation bias. Our tendency to search for, interpret, or recall information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses, often to the point where we overlook disconfirming or unwanted details. You know, we are designed on a cognitive level to look for information that confirms what we already think, and as part of that, we tend to smear over, either in our perceptions or in our memories, details that go against our expectations, go against our stereotypes. You know, you could sort of depict it this way. I have the cartoon here. A lot of people will go for a reassuring lie over an inconvenient truth, obviously making a reference to that old Al Gore movie. But I also quite like this one. Did you read my paper on confirmation bias? Yes, but it only proved what I already knew. That's the idea. Anyway, you get the idea. Those are the main biases that you need to be mindful of. The attributional biases, especially fundamental attribution error and the actor-observer bias, which play in together with the self-serving biases. These feed into the way that stereotypes function, all of which are maintained by the confirmation bias. So that brings us to the end of that. Next thing we'll talk about is attitudes and persuasion, which won't be super long, but that is where the video in the lesson plan will link to an experiment video that I really recommend you watch. It'll be very instructive. I will see you there, which is to say you'll see me there. It's a one-way medium. Bye.